afternoon. If this is a little late, I'm sorry. I've been having computer problems, and writing this thing yesterday was a nightmare. My computer keeps freezing, but I'll just get on with it. Increasingly, as you have been hearing, the whole idea that students aren't going to go do research, so they don't need this class, has been really bugging me. Now, students are not wrong to say that. I think that we've not done a good enough job explaining why this class is worth taking just to be an educated person. Um, as I showed you in the third day of class, we've been doing social research for 200 years. And now our societies are soaked in it. And you're going to run into it repeatedly. And it's worth knowing how it's made, how it's produced, and how it can go wrong. So, and all the, we're moving to the fourth section, methods. So, basics or background, and then the second section was assumptions, and then the third section was research design, and now we're actually getting down to how to do research. We're finally collecting data and then analyzing it and coming to conclusions. So the thing is, everything we've had affects what we do in the actual methods. How do you know what you know? That's the key question for the entire class, epistemology. How do you know what you know? Being a non-researcher, being a citizen in the society, which news sites can you trust? How do you know what they know? How can you trust them? Can you identify minor errors even in a site you generally trust? You can think for yourself when you start using these ideas. And behind epistemology is ontology. What are your assumptions about what is real? How does that shape what you know? How does ontology shape epistemology? What are the assumptions of the news sites, the people you're talking to, all your information sources? What are their assumptions? Really worth knowing. Knowing the difference between natural science or positivist and culturalist or constructionist methods and assumptions really helps us understand different approaches to people. Research on people. Knowing about units of analysis, causation, sampling, all that comes up in, for instance, what we're going through right now, why you're stuck at home, why you're so isolated and depressed and terrified about your future and unmotivated and don't want to listen to crap like this from some old white guy who's speaking into a microphone. This pandemic and finding out about this pandemic gets affected by units of analysis and causation and sampling and data and data and data and data. And that's what we're going to go over. So, I really hate the split between quantitative and qualitative researchers because they tend to separate into camps. I saw this when I was in a PhD program at Davis. The quantitative researchers sneered at the qualitative people, and I just think that's crazy. Both methods are really useful. Okay, I've made my case. If you don't buy it, fine. But I hope you understand everything in this course goes into this section. And this section is really useful for understanding all the information about our society that you're going to run into the rest of your life. And please be open to both quantitative and qualitative ways of thinking. All right, so the argument today is it's crucial to understand how quantitative data is collected and used in our society. We won't get too much to used. We won't get too much to analyzed. Just knowing how it is collected is really worth understanding as deeply as possible. So, what is quantitative data collection? Any method of collecting anything out there that results in numerical values. and I've got a reading on primary data. You collect your own data directly from the real world. Um, you yourself go into a hospital and make sure you collect the details on every single COVID-19 case in that hospital. You look at their chart. You talk to the doctors and the nurses. You write it down. That's primary data. Um, why do you do this? Because the data don't exist or it's not in the format you need. So you yourself, so for some reason, pretend nobody's tracking in your region. The hospitals are overwhelmed. They're not actually tracking numbers of cases, and that's not going to happen, but let's pretend. So you'd have to go out, and you'd have to go through their records, and you'd have to talk to the doctors and nurses, and etc. So you go out and you collect your own data. And it is as boring, it is as costly and time consuming as it sounds. So that chart that I keep using about bike shops per 10,000 people in those 4 cities, I've referred to it repeatedly over the class. Number of bike shops rose and then fell from 1895 to 1910. That was the single most boring part of my dissertation. It was horrible. I hated it. And here I am in Washington, D.C. It's costly. And it was time consuming. It was all this super boring time in the microfilm room in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Oh my God, I hated it. Then I had to go through and get duplicates, and I had to get numbers from all these copies. It's the year 2000, or maybe it's 2001. It's one of those two. I'm still making copies, using up money, hitting print, and then getting a piece of paper. And I had this big packet of copies, and I took it back to California, and I went through it and numbered it all out. And then you get this pretty little chart. That was primary data collection. I went to the directories, the ancestors of phone books, for those 4 cities in that microfilm room. And it was one of the most useful things I ever did. It was great. So, if the data does exist, and that's so much sweeter, and that's what, by the way, Winfred Avogo does, if for some reason you bail out of this class because it was too hard because of the whole COVID-19 thing, and you get to Soch 300 when Winfred Avogo teaches that he will use secondary data. That is, he's going to look for data sets, other people's data, someone else's data. They've already collected it, and now they're making it available to the world to do whatever they want. So the types are historical books. Historians have already written those books. That's secondary. Historians call them secondary sources. Um, Data sets, that's what sociologists tend to use. There's just this whole Excel file of numbers if we're doing quantitative data. But secondary data and primary data are both qualitative and quantitative. The rest of this PowerPoint will dig just into quantitative, but I just thought I'd tell you that primary and secondary data are both qualitative and quantitative, and C1 and C3 are mostly qualitative. Other interviews, they're getting databases of interviews that are secondary qualitative data. More, and the book mentions them. More and more and more they're doing that. But the classic use of secondary data is quantitative. And there are data sets all over, and data sets keep getting produced every year. So we start with experiments because experiments are really, um, experimental thinking is pervasive in natural science positivist methods, quantitative methods. Even if you don't, even if it doesn't look like an experiment has been conducted, experimental thinking is really important in quantitative research. This is when estimating the counterfactual becomes easy to see. In fact, this is exactly what you're trying to do in that PowerPoint I gave you 2 days ago, 2 class days ago, a week ago. The one timeline and then the two timelines, and you compare the timelines, and we can't do that in real life because there's no such thing as a time machine, so we try to get close to that. So we estimate the counterfactual. That's experimental thinking. So there are 3 features of a true experiment, and there's true and quasi experiments as you read. First, the subjects are, again, randomly assigned to control and experimental groups. We are trying to create a counterfactual that is close enough. We're estimating the counterfactual. So we're not going to run a group with people A, B, and C and then go back in time and run something different on the actual people A, B, and C. We can't do that. So we get A, B, and C in one group and D, E, and F, people D, E, and F in the second group. And we randomly choose them from the population, which means they should be close enough that we can understand causation. It's the randomization that allows us to properly estimate the counterfactual. They're least likely to be biased if we randomize selection. The second is we vary the independent variable, whatever cause we want to experiment on the experimental group, and we do nothing to the control group. That's the key. That's how we set up two timelines. The control group just does its thing, and the experimental group doesn't do its thing. We make them do something different. This is the rerunning history part. So the control group is history timeline 1, the experimental group is history timeline 2, and you compare them. This is the logic of experimental thinking. It's comparison. So you know what's different about them. And in order to know what's different about them, you have to have a post-test for both groups. It's the post-test that tells you what the effects are. So one of the limits is that you can't identify exactly why the cause had its effect. So if you remember, causal mechanisms are the exact sequence of effects from the cause. So they are the cell damage in the lungs that smoking creates over the years. As I said, Surgeon General in 1964 says to the U.S. population, cigarettes cause lung cancer, cigarettes cause emphysema. And the smoking industry, the tobacco industry, fought like tooth and nail. No, it doesn't. You have no idea why. They didn't have the causal mechanisms. Once they were able to look at it at a cellular level, and this is what the tar and the nicotine and the heat and all the other stuff in cigarette smoke does to cells in the lungs, they were able to lock it down. So when you run an experiment, you can't do that. You have to get other ways of doing that, but at least you know what caused what. And in people, so let's say you run experiments on voting, you can't get inside, you can't cut their heads open, ew, but you can't even see how they think. But it's how they think that leads them to do A or do B. And psychologists have gotten really, really creative so that they can infer how people are thinking, experiment after experiment after experiment to get at these causal mechanisms in people's heads. Field experiments are the justification for doing this in labs. A field experiment means you're experimenting out in the real world, out on the street, in offices, in classrooms. These are uncontrolled conditions. You don't have control over all the variables. In a lab, you know you have control over all the variables and you only change one. In life, there's all sorts of things going on that may cause the effect and you don't even know about. Quasi-experiments are when you have limitations of time or money or ethics, and you just can't conduct a true experiment. So experimental and control groups are similar in critical ways. Well, you don't always know what those critical ways are. You don't know. So you're doing a field experiment and you're like trying to match people in intensive care units to find out if this drug works or that drug works on COVID-19. So you give the drug to one whole hospital and you give a different drug to another hospital, and you've got a control group that uses the same old ventilators and whatever drugs you've all been using. So you got 3 different hospitals using 3 different treatments. That would be a quasi-experiment. Why? Because you don't know what the key characteristics are in the population of those people in the ICU who are fighting for their lives. Non-equivalent control group designs. You're really not really sure what the equivalents are. And another way to look at this is the two types that types of matching that you have. So one would be aggregate matching. Okay, this population in this hospital tends to be a certain population. That hospital tends to have a different population. So if you were to run a big experiment across a city, say Chicago, you look at the hospitals um, and you match the hospitals, not the individuals. So this hospital, that hospital, they have pretty similar types of patients. This hospital, oh, they have different kinds and you match them. That would be aggregate matching. But if you were to get down to the actual individuals, okay, this person is male, he's 45. We're going to match him with someone who's male and he's 46, close enough. And you're giving one drug and the other a different drug and so on. That would be a quasi-experiment. Another type of quasi-experiment is the before and after design. There's no control group, or really what you're doing is using the group itself as the control group. You're using their old history, and now you're making an intervention. And maybe this helps to understand that this is the plot of a lot of movies. For instance, A Christmas Carol. Ebenezer Scrooge has lived his life a certain way. You go on, and year after year, he's a jerk, he's miserly, he hopes the poor die and remove themselves from the excess population. Year after year after year after year after year. Okay, that's the control group. Himself as he's been going. Then one night he has an intervention. Yeah, I know. Jacob Marley conducts an intervention and then brings these 3 spirits. And lo and behold, Scrooge is different. And we don't think of this as experimental thinking, but this is exactly what a before and after experiment would be. He's doing the same old thing. Mary Poppins, Nanny McPhee, the governess comes in and changes everything. Because Nanny McPhee's great. I looked at that on YouTube. They had something like 18 different nannies who didn't work. So same old, same old. The before is the control group. It's the same group, and then after, Nanny McPhee's different, and we see it in the whole movie. That's the whole point of the movie. But you can apply this to experimental thinking. The control group is the past of the group. Then you intervene in this new way. That's the experiment. I hope that made sense. Natural experiments are those that are in the real world, not in a lab. And they're ones that researchers just sort of stumble upon rather than setting up. The exposure to the effects of the independent variable are in the real world. That's the classic definition. So first of all, yes, the 2 groups that you have are exposed to different values of the independent variable randomly. That life just did it to 2 different populations accidentally, and you just get lucky. One ship in the military has a captain who is an idiot, and he completely ignores it. And one ship has a captain who is totally on it. They're both carriers, aircraft carriers. They're both in the U.S. Navy, so the populations are similar. That's a natural experiment. One starts testing right away. He isolates right away. The other one lets it spread through his ship, and suddenly half his sailors have it, and 5 or 6 die. That's a natural experiment. That's the problem. It's the exposure is by forces outside the control of the researcher. It's a natural experiment, not a lab experiment. So you don't know for sure what has really been the case. I mean, a ship-like experiment that I just outlined would be great because the uh, conditions are relatively similar. There is enough of a control that you could probably draw conclusions. Um, but still, the forces are outside the control of the research, so you're not really sure. You don't know for sure that only one thing has been changed, which is one of the hallmarks of a true experiment. So COVID-19 is, here's an extended example. It's a natural experiment. Any pandemic is a natural experiment if public health researchers are paying attention, because you have all sorts of differences in populations as it spreads throughout the world. And different governments have different responses. So there's the Swedish model, which seemed to be doing great, and now it seems to be doing terrible. The South Koreans and the Germans, tons and tons of testing. As soon as you get a positive, isolate that person. If they go into a hospital, or if they get sick, put them in a hospital early. That was the German thing. Don't wait until they get really sick to take them to the hospital. Put them in a hospital early. That has reduced their death rate, as far as we can tell. Masks. That's another experiment. Some countries have been pushing masks really hard. Other countries have not been pushing masks really hard. Contact tracing, testing, and then contact tracing, and then testing them, and then contact tracing and testing them. That's another experiment. See, that's a natural experiment. We are right now conducting a natural experiment in epidemiology because, as I said, COVID-19 is new. It has its own characteristics. So you have to sort of, in some ways, start over. You don't totally start over because we dealt with pandemics, but it has its own characteristics. So they have to experiment on how this works. And, you know, the Americans didn't do all that well, but they're okay. And the Brazilians are, their president is actively encouraging people to die. I'm sorry, that's my opinion. But you can look at the effects of government. You can look at the effects of how the national government is influencing the course of the pandemic through their populations. That would very much be social research, very much be public health research, and you would be treating this as, if you're the researcher looking at different countries and comparing all their approaches, you're basically thinking in terms of a natural experiment. Survey research is completely different from experiments. Now you can, and Sussbrecher does, wrap experiments into surveys, but it's better just in general to treat it as a different animal. And almost always surveys produce quantitative data. They produce numbers. So we'll get to the exceptions. They produce qualitative data, but when you are writing up your methods section in your final paper, remember, interviews are qualitative, surveys are quantitative. And I will be very explicit about the exceptions because next fall Maria Schmeckley is likely to use qualitative surveys, but you have to know that's rare. So they're very attractive because they are low cost, they are generalizable if you do your sampling and other, you know, all of the stuff, but especially sampling properly. And they're very versatile. You can apply them to political polling. You can apply them to marketing. This is really where it's worth knowing how this stuff is produced as a person who will never do research. You're going to get researched. You are the subject of research a lot in marketing, in political polling. Those are the two big ones. There are other reasons, environmental attitudes. That's one of the reasons that they do omnibus surveys. where they collect data on a wide range of topics, and they make sure to have really good sampling procedures, starting with a lot of people, large sample. Um, and these omnibus surveys are carried out over the years so that you can compare attitudes over the years. Things like the General Social Survey, which is out of the University of Chicago, they just make their data available to everybody else. And that's why they have a wide range of topics. You don't have to, as a person using their data, you're treating it as secondary data, you don't have to address everything they've asked about. You just address one thing. Well, that's why they do it. They make it a wide range of topics so a lot of different researchers around the country can treat it as secondary data and get a lot out of it. But whether it's an omnibus survey or a very targeted survey by a political firm or a marketing firm, there are problems. So the first problem is satisficing. And that means sufficient and satisfactory, I think. Um, you're putting in minimal effort. You're not doing that much to answer the question. Somebody's shoved this survey at you, and you're like, yeah, fine, whatever. And you just check a bunch of boxes. Okay, bye. Um, that's not going to tell you much. You're going to end up with poor measurement of what people are really thinking. So you need to find a way around that, whether it's how you approach them or whether you give them money, which does happen, or whatever it is to make sure that you get them answering really well instead of minimally. Non-response is really a huge and growing problem in political polling. Um, I looked at numbers, something like 6% respond out of, first of all, you're only doing a sample of like 1,000 people. And second, um, you call them up or you stop them on the street or whatever, and only 6% are going to say, yeah, I'll answer your questions. The other 94% say, get stuffed, and they walk away or they hang up. So that is really hard for political pollsters. And it's really increasingly frustrating for marketers. So the answer, the way you handle that is answer weighting. You weight the answers depending on the population, the kind of people you are asking. Um, that's one way to handle non-response. There's lots of ways to handle non-response. Another problem is the inadequate sample frame. It produces, excuse me, non-representative results. So again, probability sampling means two things. You have a list of everyone in the population, which means everyone has an equal chance of being selected, so you can randomize, so you can reduce or eliminate bias. And then, therefore, you can get a good sample. If you don't have a sampling frame, that means you don't have a complete list. That means some elements of the population are missing, which means your sample is skewed or biased, and therefore it's not representative. So what conclusions can you draw from that you can trust? Well, maybe none. That's the problem. All right, and just plain old sampling error. How do you get around that? Well, one way to do that, I mean, all three of these things can produce sampling error. How do you get around it? In political polling, they've recently taken to poll aggregating, which means Quinnipiac will do a poll, and Rasmussen will do a poll, and Real Clear Politics will do a poll, and other polling firms will do a poll. Excuse me. And you look at this. So Biden is beating Trump right now, or Trump is beating Biden, or whoever is beating whoever. In political opinion, let's say the numbers are 53% will vote for Biden in one poll, 54% will vote for him in a different poll, 51% will vote for him in a third poll. And you get a sense of where the two candidates, because that's pretty much what it is. Sorry, Bernie Bros. Um, you get a sense of that by doing different polls by different pollsters with different methodologies. That's what we mean by poll aggregating. Okay, the most important thing to do when you write a survey is write good questions. The quote is right from the book, the single most important concern. And the very first thing is people and interpretations vary. Very constructivist approach. People are different. People think differently. Humans are not atoms. Humans are not animals. They think for themselves. They are part of different groups. They're shaped by their culture. They're shaped by their experiences, their social positions. You need to take this into account when you are doing surveys. So one way to do this is to just brainstorm. What do you want to know? Shoot out a ton of questions. Lots and lots of different questions. Then go back through them and revise them carefully. This is a classic way to generate a survey. But it is legitimate to use other surveys. Take their questions verbatim. Just take the exact wording of the question. Take the wording of the question and change it. One question on a survey gives you an idea of another question, which is completely different, but you use the old survey to generate your new thinking on the issue. So using old surveys is a great way to come up with new surveys. You pick and choose, obviously. But really crucially, I mentioned this in section 3. You do cognitive interviewing. So cognitive interviewing, that's when you're conceptualizing, operationalizing, and measuring. Remember, conceptualization, operationalization, and measurement. You're turning your concepts into measurements. You see the process very clearly in writing survey questions. So the thing to do is write your questions and do a field test. Ask people. And you're not using the data that you collect. You're asking a few people, and then you interview them about how they thought about the question. First you interview them. First you survey them. They give an answer. Then you say, okay, what did that really mean to you? And you'd be surprised at how people interpret different questions. Then you have to make the revisions. Oh my God, you have to be really careful about making your revisions. Then you can use the survey to generate actual data. But first you should field test, interview people about what they thought, rewrite the questions, do it a few times. Field test, rewrite. Field test, rewrite. Once you get results that you think you can trust, that are valid and reliable, that's when you actually start collecting data you're going to use. Now we have this long list of advice from the book. I'm going to comment on each one of them. You never know when you're going to end up writing a survey on the job. The economy, yes, you're really scared. Yes, you're graduating in December. But that means you don't know what sort of job you're going to get. You may get a job where you have to write a survey. It is not impossible. In recoveries, a lot of new businesses start, and you may be part of a new business, and they may not know their customers and need to do surveys. So, short sentences and words. Yes, keep it simple. Complex words and statements will lose your research subjects, and if you lose them, you won't get valid, reliable results. Break up complex issues. I'm going to say this in two different places. 3 different places, really. 1 issue per question. If there's a complex issue, think about the issue. Break it up into its pieces. So say you think through an issue, and a complex issue has 3 different aspects to it. Well, you need 3 different questions. Keep it simple. No double negatives. So, for instance, will you not vote against Donald Trump in the fall? What? How about, will you vote for Donald Trump? That's really simple. Don't have double negatives. Keep it straightforward and clear. Okay, emotional words generally means that somebody's doing one of 2 things. They're running an experiment on you wrapped in a survey, so they're like Seuss Brecker, or more likely, way more likely, they're push polling. And push polling usually is meant to whip up the faithful, almost always, to get money from you. So if you see a poll that has really leading questions, really emotional questions, you find yourself getting angrier and angrier and going, yes, that's getting really pissed off. They're trying to manipulate you because you watch 5 or 6 questions, 7 questions in. At the end, they'll say, will you donate? And you know what? It works. And it's one reason response rates are going down because sometimes they're not real surveys. They're not trying to find out what's actually true. They just want to whip up the faithful. It's a great campaign tactic. It generates money. It generates emails, which generate more money, but it's not serious research. They're not finding the truth. They're not even trying. No overlapping choices. This is stupid and obvious, but you will still see some answers that overlap, which just doesn't make any sense. You should allow only one possible response on, say, a Likert scale. Yes, again, it's not Likert, it's Likert. If it's 1 through 5, you shouldn't allow people to choose 2 and 3. It's 2 or it's 3. So using skip patterns, you'll see these. Filter and contingent questions, what that means is, okay, if your answer is yes, answer these 3 questions. If your answer is no, skip these 3 questions. That's is it yes or is it no? That's a filter question. And the contingent questions are contingents upon your answering yes or no. They've found out, number 8, they've found out that something like 10% of all people, if you put the word agree in the question, will just say yes. They hate people being mad at them. They hate disagreement. I personally don't understand it, but then I've always been an opinionated little jerk. So I'm happy to say no. I disagree. But there, you got to use different language. Don't use the word agree. Use support, use oppose, use something else. Excuse me. But watch out for the agreeable people in the population, or you're not going to get valid results. And finally, minimize fence sitting and floating. Now this is, I'm ambivalent about this one. Every time I read this in the reading every semester, I go, this is really fair. Some people truly are neutral. They're really not sure, or they just don't have an opinion. And in a lot of cases, in polls, the pollsters assume, no, actually, you do. You just don't want to admit it. You do have an opinion. And so you force people into an opinion. I think this is more appropriate closer to an election, for instance. Um, I there are reasons for doing this, and there are reasons for not doing it. I would tend to not do it, but pollsters sometimes have to do it. Okay, so again, I'm going to emphasize this. When you say the word survey, you should automatically think this produces numbers. This is quantitative. You should have it in your mind, especially if you're signed up for Maria Schmeckley's Soch 300 next fall, that people who use qualitative surveys are the exception. And Maria is one of those exceptions. If you read the report that they produced last semester, they relied on qualitative surveys. These are rare, but they exist. I mean, I have the feeling Maria would say, oh, they're not all that rare. They're pretty rare. If you look at political polls and you look at marketing surveys and even in academia where you're just trying to find stuff out like the General Social Survey or other omnibus surveys, the census, mostly it's quantitative data. But there are people out there. So if you ever talk about a survey that's going to generate open-ended answers, answers you can't predict, answers that are not on a Likert scale, then say qualitative survey. Be explicit about it. Okay, I hope I've made the case that, well, it's possible to understand how quantitative data is collected and used. And I also hope that I made the case that It's crucial as an educated person to understand this, even if you never do research outside of Soch 300 again in your life. You will be surveyed. Maybe there will be experiments that you're part of that you don't even know about. You'll be reading about them in the news. And if you understand experimental thinking and estimating the counterfactual, you can make more sense of what you read in the news. And yeah, you're 20 something right now. There's research showing over and over and over. The older you get, the more you read the news, the more you pay attention to politics, the more you vote. It sounds like it's completely useless to you right now. That is going to change. We know that. So please keep this all in the back of your mind. There are ways to understand surveys. There are ways to understand experiments. Experimental thinking is pervasive in quantitative research, and it's worth knowing how it's done.